My son said, "You're moving to a nursing home. I'm selling all your property." I signed the papers with a smirk. He didn't know that my friend the notary had prepared a special surprise for them on the day of the deal. When he pulled out the papers. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I was 73 years old when my own son looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer needed in my own home. But let me start at the beginning, because nothing in life begins with the worst moment. It begins with small things, quiet things, the kind of things you notice only when you look back and realize they were warnings all along. I had lived in the same house on Elm Creek Road for 41 years. A white Craftsman with green shutters, a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, and a garden I had tended with my own hands since Robert and I moved in the summer of 1982. Robert passed 11 years ago. Cancer. The quiet kind that gives you time to say goodbye, but not enough time to ever feel ready. After he was gone, the house became both my comfort and my anchor. My roots were in those floorboards. My memories were pressed into every wall like dried flowers. My son, Gary, was 51. He had his father's height, but none of his patience. He had married a woman named Brenda, thin-lipped, sharp-eyed, always smiling in a way that never reached anywhere near warmth. They lived 40 minutes away in a newer subdivision, the kind where every house looks like a copy of a copy. They had 2 children, teenagers now, who called me Grandma Dorothy at Christmas and forgot I existed the rest of the year. For most of my life, I had believed Gary was simply busy. That's what I told myself. He worked in commercial real estate, long hours, high pressure. Brenda managed the household with military precision. They came to Thanksgiving. They called on birthdays, usually. I made excuses for the gaps the way mothers do, the way we fill silences with our own explanations so we don't have to hear what the silence is actually saying. The first sign came 18 months before everything fell apart. Gary and Brenda came for Sunday dinner, unannounced, which was unusual. I had pot roast on the stove and was happy for the company. But over the meal, Gary kept looking around the house in a way I can only describe as appraising, not nostalgic, not affectionate. The way a man looks at something he's calculating the value of. He asked, almost casually, whether I had thought about downsizing, whether the house wasn't a lot to manage alone, whether I had considered a continuing care community. He used that phrase carefully, the way people say funeral home when they mean something that smells like disinfectant and forgotten people. I told him I was managing just fine. I had a cleaning woman who came Thursdays. I drove myself to the grocery store and to my book club and to church. I had friends. I had my garden. I had my life. He nodded and said nothing more that evening. But Brenda watched me with those flat eyes of hers, and something in my chest went cold. Over the following months, the visits increased. That alone should have told me something. Gary had never been attentive without a reason. He started asking about my finances. Had I thought about my will? Was my attorney still that old fellow downtown? He said it the way you say that old jalopy, as if age made something automatically suspect. He asked to see the deed to the house just to make sure everything was in order. I said everything was perfectly in order. Thank you very much. He smiled. Brenda smiled. 2 smiles that matched in exactly the wrong way. Then came the morning I will never forget. It was a Tuesday in October, cold and gray, the maple out front already stripped bare. Gary arrived at 9 in the morning without calling. He sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had fed him oatmeal for 18 years, and he folded his hands on the surface and said the words. "Mom, I've arranged for a placement at Maplewood Senior Living. It's a good facility, Clean, well-staffed. You'll be comfortable there. I'm selling the house. The market's strong right now. And your furniture, the car, most of the household contents. I'm going to liquidate those as well. I've already spoken to a real estate attorney. I sat very still. You're signing the paperwork this week, he said. I have power of attorney. It's the right decision. And I, 73 years old, widow, gardener, reader of books, maker of pot roast, looked at my son across my own kitchen table, and I smiled. Not because I agreed, not because I was frightened into compliance. I smiled because in that exact moment, something quiet and certain settled into place inside me. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. He did not know what I knew. He did not know what I had already done. And he absolutely did not know what my old friend Harold Weiss, notary, retired estate attorney, and one of the sharpest minds in the county, had prepared and waiting in a locked drawer in his office. But he would find out. After Gary left that Tuesday morning, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The pot on the stove was cold. The light had shifted from gray to something flatter, the way October light does when the sun gives up pretending. I remember looking at my hands on the table, spotted, veined, the hands of an old woman, people would say, and thinking, these hands built this life. Every single piece of it. Was I afraid? Yes. I won't pretend otherwise because pretending would be dishonest, and dishonesty has never served anyone well. I was afraid in the specific hollow way you feel afraid when something you thought was safe turns out not to have been safe at all. Not a sudden terror, more like discovering a crack in the foundation you've been walking over for years. I was afraid of the nursing home, not of the concept of care, not of aging. I was not naive about what was coming for my body eventually. But Maplewood, I knew of it. A woman from my church, Edna Bryce, had been placed there by her daughter 2 years ago. I had visited Edna 3 times. The facility was clean, yes, in the way that institutions are clean. Surfaces wiped, smells masked, everything beige. Edna sat in a chair by the window and watched the parking lot. She died 8 months after admission. The doctor called it cardiac decline. I called it a broken spirit. I was afraid of losing the house. Robert and I had paid it off completely by 1998. There was no mortgage, no lien, no debt of any kind. The property, as of the previous spring, had been appraised at $640,000. The furniture, antiques, many of them, Robert's grandmother's sideboard, a secretary desk I had inherited from my own mother, was worth considerable money to the right buyer. The car was a 3-year-old Buick, paid in full. Gary had called it liquidating assets. What he meant was erasing my life and pocketing the proceeds. And the power of attorney, that was the thing that frightened me most of all. I stood up from the table and went to the roll-top desk in the study. In the second drawer, behind a folder of old utility bills, was the document Gary had presented to me 14 months earlier. He had framed it as routine elder planning. Just a precaution, Mom, in case something happens and you can't make decisions. His attorney had drawn it up. I had been tired that day, coming off a bad cold, and I had not read it as carefully as I should have. That failure was mine, and I owned it completely. But here was the thing Gary did not know. 3 weeks after signing that document, I had taken it to Harold Weiss. Harold had been Robert's closest friend from their Navy days. He was 78 now, semi-retired, but still sharp as a tack and still licensed as a notary and estate consultant in the state. I had brought him the power of attorney over coffee at his kitchen table, and Harold had read it with the kind of silence that precedes a diagnosis. When he finished, he set it down and said, "Dorothy, this document is very broad, and the circumstances under which it was obtained may matter a great deal. Don't do anything yet, but don't lose this copy." That had been 13 months ago. I had done nothing yet. I had watched. I had waited. I had given Gary the benefit of the doubt, or perhaps I had given myself the mercy of not having to act. But Tuesday morning had ended that mercy. I picked up the phone and called Harold. He answered on the second ring. I told him what Gary had said. There was a pause on his end. Not surprise, I thought, but the pause of a man organizing his thoughts precisely. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," he said, "and bring everything. Every document, every bank statement you have access to, every piece of paper Gary has ever given you to sign. We're going to sort through all of it." I spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Tuesday night going through my files. I had always been organized. Robert used to tease me about my filing system, color-coded tabs and everything dated in the margin. Now I was grateful for it. I pulled the power of attorney, the deed to the house, my will, a document I had drafted myself with a different attorney 12 years ago before Gary had involved himself, my bank statements, my investment account summaries, and a small leather notebook in which I had been, for the past several months, recording dates and exact words of every concerning conversation with Gary. I had not known why I was keeping that notebook. Habit, perhaps, or instinct. Now I understood it had been preparation. By midnight, I had a full folder, organized and tabbed. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat with it at the kitchen table, and I looked around the room. The green curtains I had sewn myself in 1989, the framed watercolor of the Maine coast that Robert had bought on our anniversary trip, the crack in the plaster above the doorway that neither of us had ever gotten around to fixing. And I made a decision. I was not going to Maplewood. I was not signing anything, and Gary was not selling one single stick of furniture from this house. What I needed was a plan, not an emotional one, not a reactive one. A quiet, careful, legally airtight plan that would dismantle Gary's intentions before he even understood what was happening. The first piece of that plan was Harold. The second piece was my own documentation. The third piece, and this one came to me slowly, over the tea, in the quiet of the house, was something I had been sitting on for a very long time without realizing its power. My house was not as Gary imagined it to be, and my will was not what he expected it to say. And the power of attorney, the one he believed gave him full authority over my affairs, had a flaw in it, a significant one. Harold had seen it 13 months ago and said nothing until it was needed. It was needed now. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. I did not sleep immediately, but when sleep came, it was deep and dreamless. The sleep of someone who has finally stopped waiting and started moving. Harold's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Pemberton Street, above a dry cleaner that had been there since 1974. I had been to that office perhaps a dozen times over the years, for Robert's estate after he passed, for the original drafting of my will, for small things here and there. It smelled of old paper and coffee and something faintly like pipe tobacco, though Harold had quit smoking years ago. Some smells are loyal even after the source is gone. I arrived at 9 in the morning with my folder and a tin of the shortbread cookies Harold liked. He was already at his desk when his assistant let me in, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a legal pad in front of him. He looked at the folder I set on his desk, then at me, and he nodded once, the way men of his generation nod when they understand the weight of a thing without needing it explained. We spent 3 hours going through everything. The power of attorney was the first document Harold examined with real deliberation. He had seen it before, of course, but now he spread it flat and went through it clause by clause. What he explained to me, carefully, in plain language, the way he always had, was this. The document Gary had presented was a durable power of attorney, meant to activate if I became incapacitated. It was not a general power of attorney effective immediately. It granted Gary authority over financial decisions only in the event that a licensed physician certified my inability to manage my own affairs. No such certification existed. No physician had evaluated me. I was, by every legal standard, a fully competent adult. "He's been behaving as though this document gives him current authority," Harold said, tapping the page. "It does not. And if he has represented it that way to a real estate attorney, that attorney is either poorly informed or being deliberately misled." "Or complicit," I said. Harold looked at me over his glasses. "Let's not assume more than we can prove. Yet." The second thing Harold addressed was my existing will. I had drafted it in 2013, leaving the house and the bulk of my estate to Gary, with smaller bequests to my church, my niece Patricia in Portland, and the local public library. It was a generous document. It was also, Harold noted, entirely within my power to revoke and replace. "Before we do anything else," he said, "I want you to understand your position clearly. You are legally competent. You own this property outright. You have no legal obligation to sign any document Gary presents to you. He cannot force a sale. He cannot place you anywhere without a court-ordered guardianship, which requires a formal competency evaluation, an attorney ad litem, and a judge's approval. That process takes time, months typically, and it is not a foregone conclusion." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like the restoration of solid ground underfoot. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Harold listed it plainly. 1. Revoke the existing power of attorney immediately and formally, with documentation. 2. Draft a new will with updated terms. 3. Place the house in a revocable living trust, in my name, managed by me, with a successor trustee of my choosing, who was emphatically not Gary. 4. Send a formal written notice to Gary, via certified mail, return receipt requested, advising him that I had legal counsel and that any further attempts to execute documents on my behalf without proper authority would be considered fraudulent. It was that fourth step that would tell us everything, because Gary's reaction to the letter would show us exactly what we were dealing with. Harold's assistant prepared the revocation of power of attorney that same afternoon. I signed it in front of Harold as notary, and he filed a copy with the county recorder's office. It was official. The document Gary had relied on was now a nullity. I drove home feeling something I can only describe as armed, but the next morning I had proof of something I had suspected, but not confirmed. I received a call from my bank, First Heritage Savings, where I had held accounts for 30 years. A customer service representative named Alicia informed me, with some hesitation, that someone had called the previous week inquiring about my account balances, claiming to be managing my affairs. The inquiry had been flagged because the caller had not known my security passphrase. Alicia wanted to confirm I was aware of the inquiry and to suggest I update my security settings. I sat down. "Did they give a name?" I asked. A pause. "The name given was Gary Callahan. He identified himself as your son and power of attorney." There it was. He had used a document that granted him no current authority to attempt to access my financial information. He had misrepresented his legal standing to my bank. Whether this crossed into fraud was a question for attorneys, but it was unambiguously a deliberate misuse of a legal instrument. I thanked Alicia, updated every security credential on my accounts, and called Harold immediately. "Save that information," Harold said, without missing a beat. "Get the bank's documentation of that inquiry in writing. That is exactly the kind of evidence we needed." I requested the written record from First Heritage Savings that same day. They mailed it within 48 hours. And that evening, Gary called me. His voice was lighter than usual, artificially casual, the way it gets when he's working toward something. "Just checking in, Mom. Have you given any more thought to what we discussed?" "I'm thinking about it," I said pleasantly. "Good," he said. "I've scheduled the meeting with the real estate attorney for the 14th, 2 weeks out. That should give you plenty of time." I said that sounded fine. I did not tell him about Harold. I did not tell him about the revocation. I did not tell him about First Heritage Savings and the letter that was already sitting in Harold's file. The 14th. He had given me 2 weeks, as if he were doing me a courtesy, as if he were in charge of the schedule. How little he understood about what was already in motion. The 2 weeks before the 14th were the busiest of my life since Robert's funeral, but they were busy in a quiet, purposeful way, the way serious work always is when you know exactly what you're building toward. Harold and I met 3 more times in that period. By the end of the first week, the Revocable Living Trust had been drafted, reviewed, and executed. The house on Elm Creek Road was no longer titled solely in my name. It was now held in the Dorothy Callahan Living Trust, with me as trustee and my niece Patricia as successor trustee upon my death or incapacity. Patricia was 54, a retired school principal in Portland, sharp and steady, and she had always treated me with genuine affection rather than inventory-taking interest. She agreed without hesitation when I called and explained the situation. Her silence on the phone, when I finished, had a quality I recognized: the silence of someone who is not surprised and who is furious on your behalf. The new will was drafted in the same week. It was a significantly different document from the 2013 version. Gary was no longer the primary beneficiary of the estate. The house, in trust, would pass to Patricia. My investment accounts, approximately $240,000, were divided: 40% to Patricia, 30% to my church's building fund, 20% to the library, and 10% to a college scholarship fund in Robert's name, which Harold helped me establish through the county foundation. Gary received a specific bequest of $5,000 and my father's old pocket watch. Not nothing, but nothing close to what he had been anticipating. I signed the new will on a Thursday afternoon with Harold as notary and his assistant, and a retired neighbor of Harold's as witnesses. 3 signatures on that document, all legal, all witnessed, all dated. It went into Harold's safe. On the following Monday, I received the certified letter receipt confirmation from Gary. He had signed for the notice Harold had sent on my behalf, advising him that I had retained legal counsel and that any further action on my accounts or property without proper authority would be treated accordingly. Gary's signature on that green return receipt card was, in its way, a small and perfect thing. He called me 40 minutes after he must have opened it. The lightness in his voice was entirely gone. "What is this?" he said. Not a greeting, not a hello. "Exactly what it says," I told him. "Mom, you've gone to some attorney? What are you thinking? We're trying to do what's best for you." "Harold Weiss is handling my affairs," I said calmly. "He's been a family friend for 40 years. I'm confident in his judgment. Harold Weiss is 78 years old, and still fully licensed and entirely competent, yes." The silence on his end had a texture to it. I could hear Brenda in the background, a whisper, the sound of a door. "Mom," Gary said, and his voice shifted, lower, harder, stripped of the performed patience. "You need to understand something. I have power of attorney. That document is legal and valid. If you think you can just hire someone to—" "The power of attorney was revoked 11 days ago," I said. "The documentation has been filed with the county recorder. If you need the filing number, Harold can provide it." Another silence. Longer this time. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. "I think I have quite a clear idea," I replied. He hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, listening to the house. The tick of the hallway clock, the wind in the maple outside, the quiet that had been mine for 41 years. Then my hands began to shake slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from the physical reality of having said the true thing out loud to the person who needed to hear it. They came 3 days later. Gary and Brenda together. At 7 in the evening, not a call in advance. I saw the headlights in the driveway and knew before they knocked. I had prepared for this. I let them in. This was still my home, and I was not afraid of them in it. And we sat in the living room, the same room where Gary had learned to walk, where Robert and I had celebrated every Christmas for 4 decades. Brenda did most of the talking, which was itself informative. She was controlled, precise, the words clearly rehearsed. Dorothy, we're worried about you. This behavior, hiring outside attorneys, revoking documents without talking to us first, it's not like you. Frankly, it concerns us about your state of mind. We have an obligation, as your family. You have no legal obligation to me, I said, and no legal authority over me. That was established 11 days ago. Gary leaned forward. We can petition for guardianship. Do you understand that? We can have a judge look at your behavior and your decisions, and you can try, I said. And Harold will represent me in that proceeding. I'll submit to any competency evaluation a court orders. I welcome it. That stopped them. Because a guardianship petition requires evidence of incapacity, and they had none. I was articulate, organized, legally represented, financially coherent, and in excellent health according to my physician, who had given me a full wellness exam the previous spring. They had nothing, and they knew it. They left 20 minutes later. Gary's face as he walked out was something I will not easily forget. A man who has played a card he believed was a trump card and watched it land as nothing. I closed the door, locked it, and sat in Robert's old chair by the fireplace. For 3 days after that, I allowed myself to rest. I called Patricia and we talked for 2 hours. I went to my book club on Wednesday. We were reading a Barbara Kingsolver novel, which gave us plenty to argue about pleasantly. I had dinner on Thursday with my neighbor Constance and her husband, and we sat on their porch until 9 o'clock in the evening and watched the last of the autumn light fade from the sky. I slept without difficulty. I tended the garden in the mornings, even though there wasn't much left to tend at that time of year. Just the cleanup, the cutting back, the preparation for winter, which felt in its way exactly appropriate. I had things to prepare for, and I was ready. It was Brenda who made the first move, and she made it in the way women like Brenda always do, not with confrontation, but with softness. A calculated softness, the kind that has edges underneath. She called on a Saturday morning, 11 days after she and Gary had left my living room with nothing. Her voice was different from the meeting, warmer, rounder, with a practiced catch of emotion in it. Dorothy, I feel terrible about how things went last week. That's not how I wanted it to go. We both said things that were too sharp, and I've been thinking about it, and I don't want this to become a legal battle between family. That's not what any of us want. I let her speak. I had learned a long time ago that silence is one of the most useful tools available to a person because other people cannot tolerate it and will keep filling it, and usually what they fill it with is exactly what you need to hear. Gary and I have talked. We're willing to step back from the Maplewood idea, for now. We hear you. We understand you want to stay in the house. But I was wondering, and I know this might feel like I'm overstepping, whether you might reconsider the financial power of attorney, just for emergency purposes. Not the same document, something narrower, just so that if something ever happened to you suddenly, we could step in and help. Wouldn't that give you peace of mind? And there it was, the silk over the same wire. I understood exactly what she was doing. The guardianship threat had failed because I was too visibly competent and too well represented. So now she was trying another door, a new power of attorney, narrower sounding, more sympathetically framed. Something that, once signed, could be quietly expanded or misused in exactly the same way the first one had been nearly misused. Brenda, I said, I appreciate the call. I've made my arrangements with Harold and I'm comfortable with them. If there's ever a genuine emergency, Patricia is my successor trustee. She's been informed of everything, and she's prepared to act if needed. A pause. Patricia. She said my niece's name with the precise flatness of someone tasting something they were not expecting and do not like. Yes, I said pleasantly. I see. Another pause. Well, I hope you know that Gary and I come from a place of love. We care about you. I know you called, I said, which was not quite the same thing as agreeing with her, but she did not press the distinction. After we hung up, I sat with a cup of tea and felt the steadiness in my chest that I had come to recognize over those weeks. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of certainty. A compass that had found its direction and was no longer spinning. Was I tempted? In some technical sense, perhaps. Not by Brenda's offer. I had seen through that before she finished her second sentence. But by the simpler, older temptation that every parent knows. The wish that the conflict were not real. That the children you raised were the people you hoped you'd raised. That you could simply go back to Sunday dinners and pot roast and the easier version of the story. That temptation was real. I did not insult it by pretending it wasn't. But I had looked at Gary's face in my living room. I had held the bank's letter about the unauthorized inquiry. I had read the power of attorney in Harold's office and understood what it had been intended to do. These things were not feelings. They were facts. And I had never, in 73 years, found that the world improved when you chose comfort over facts. So I set the temptation down, the way you set down something you've picked up and then recognized you have no use for, and I moved on. In the weeks that followed, Gary and Brenda went quiet. Not absent. I was certain they were monitoring the situation, watching for an opening, regrouping. But they made no further direct contact, sent no more letters. It was the quiet of people waiting to see what you'll do next. And I found my support. I had not spoken publicly about what was happening. That had been a deliberate choice. Elderly women fighting their own children over property can be painted, very easily, as confused, as emotional, as overreacting. I did not want my situation to become a story that other people got to tell for me. So I had been careful and selective. But there were 3 women I trusted with my whole heart, and I told them. Constance, my neighbor, who had been married 42 years and raised 4 children and knew the texture of family betrayal the way you know the texture of your own kitchen table. She listened to everything, said, "That little bastard," only once, and then immediately, practically, offered to drive me to any appointment I needed and to be a witness to anything that required one. My friend Vera from church, 70 years old, a retired social worker who had spent 3 decades navigating elder law issues in her professional capacity. She knew the legal landscape I was moving through, not abstractly, but specifically, and she confirmed everything Harold had told me, and added several things I hadn't considered about documenting my mental acuity on an ongoing basis: medical records, dated correspondence, all of it time-stamped and coherent. And my daughter-in-law from my late brother's marriage, Ellen, who lived an hour away in Springfield and who had always had a clear-eyed view of Gary that I had sometimes resented and now was grateful for. Ellen had a son who was a family law paralegal. She called him on my behalf, and he provided free of charge a plain language summary of the guardianship process in our state, what would be required of Gary to succeed, and what the statistical likelihood of that success was given the evidence I had assembled. The summary was not long. It was mostly reassuring. I was not alone. I had never really been alone. But there is a particular kind of aloneness that comes from being a widow in a large house, from having a son who looks at your furniture and sees numbers, from being old in a world that treats oldness as a problem to be managed. that particular aloneness I had been living with for longer than I had admitted. These three women, and Harold and Patricia, they pushed it back. Not entirely, but enough. And in the pushing back, I found something I had not expected. Energy. The kind that comes not from youth, but from conviction. I had a fight in front of me, and I intended to win it. And the knowledge of that, the clean, simple certainty of it, made me feel more like myself than I had in years. They came on a Sunday. Of course they did. Sunday, because Sunday is family day, because Sunday carries a weight of obligation and normalcy that weekdays don't. You can't easily tell someone to leave on a Sunday without it feeling like a rupture of something sacred. They had thought about the timing. I credited them that. It was early afternoon, just after 1. I had been to the 10 o'clock service and come home and changed out of my good clothes and was reading in the sitting room when I heard Gary's car in the drive. Through the window, I saw both of them get out. Gary carrying a paper bag from the bakery downtown, the kind with handles, the kind you bring when you're trying to signal peace. Brenda was dressed more softly than usual, a gray cardigan instead of her usual structured blazer, hair down. The costume of reconciliation. I let them in. I offered them coffee. I did not make it easy, but I did not make it a battle before there was a battle to be had. There's a difference between being guarded and being impolite, and I have always believed that your behavior during the approach tells you as much as anything the other person says. Gary set the bakery bag on the table. It contained a pecan coffee cake, which had been my favorite since he was a child, and which I suspected he had remembered specifically for this occasion. He sat across from me and looked at his hands for a moment, and for just a second I saw in his face the boy I had carried home from the hospital, the boy who had been afraid of thunderstorms until he was 9 years old, and I felt the old grief of it, not the anger, but the grief, which is always underneath the anger, always closer to the true thing. Then Brenda spoke, and the grief went back where it lived. Dorothy, we've been doing a lot of thinking, about everything, about how we handled it, and I want to be honest, we didn't handle it well. The way Gary approached you in October was wrong. We were too direct. Too businesslike about something that should have been a conversation between family. I nodded and said nothing. The thing is, she continued, leaning forward with her hands clasped in a way that looked sincere, we are worried about you. Not about the house, not about the money, about you. You're 73. You're living alone in this big house, and we love you. And the idea of something happening to you and us not being there. Nothing is happening to me, I said. We know that. We know you're healthy and capable, and we've never said otherwise. But life is unpredictable, Dorothy. You know that better than anyone. After Robert. She paused. She had used Robert's name deliberately. I noticed it the way you notice a hand reaching for something. After Robert, she said again, more gently. Gary felt. He feels responsible for you. He's your son. He worries. And I think the legal situation has gotten out of hand in a way that none of us wanted. And we're asking you as family, to step back from the attorney involvement. Just have a conversation with us, just the three of us, about what you actually want for your future. Without outside voices in it. Outside voices, I repeated. Harold Weiss, she said, and there was just the smallest edge returning beneath the softness, is not your family. He doesn't know what's best for you the way we do. He's an old man with his own interests and his own. Harold is my attorney and my friend, I said, and his professional advice has been entirely in my interest, which is more than I can currently say for yours. A silence. Gary looked up from his hands. Mom, I'm asking you, as your son, to drop this. Drop the trust. Drop the new will. Drop all of it. Come back to the table with us and let's handle this like family. If you keep going down this road, it gets ugly. For all of us. Is that what you want? Was that a threat? It was the shape of a threat, wearing the language of appeal. But yes, underneath the grief boy voice and the Sunday afternoon and the pecan coffee cake, it was a threat. Come back, or it gets ugly. Gary, I said, I have very little interest in ugly, but I have no interest at all in reversing decisions I made correctly and legally and with full understanding of my own situation. The trust stands. The will stands. Harold stands. Brenda's composure cracked, just at the edges. Her jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. I've made mistakes in my life, I told her. This isn't one of them. They left 25 minutes later. Gary didn't say goodbye when he walked out. Brenda did. 2 syllables, precise, cold. The paper bag with the coffee cake sat on my kitchen table. I looked at it for a while. Then I wrapped it up carefully and brought it to Constance next door. Because it was a good coffee cake, and there was no reason for good food to go to waste over bad behavior. After they left, I did feel something close to fear. I want to be honest about that. Not the earlier hollow fear of displacement, but a sharper thing. The fear of escalation, of a son who had just told me, in terms as clear as he was capable of, that he was willing to make things unpleasant if I didn't yield. I did not know exactly what form ugly would take. Legal harassment? A guardianship filing with manufactured evidence? A campaign among our wider social circle to paint me as erratic? I sat with that fear for a time, gave it space, looked at it squarely, and then I let it do what fear does when you don't run from it. It turned into fuel. Cold, clean, efficient fuel. Every moment I had second-guessed myself, every flicker of maybe I'm overreacting, maybe Gary means well, maybe I should give him one more chance. All of it burned away. What he had shown me, across 3 separate visits now, was a consistent and unambiguous intention. He wanted what I had, and he was willing to use whatever was at hand to get it. I called Harold that evening, told him about the visit. Good, he said quietly. Now we know exactly where we stand. Yes, I said. Now we know. The 14th, the date Gary had set for the real estate meeting, was still 10 days away. He didn't know yet that I had never intended to miss it. The 14th came on a Thursday, cold and bright, the kind of November morning that is beautiful if you are in a condition to notice beauty. I dressed carefully. Not for them, for myself. I wore the navy blazer I had bought the year Robert and I went to Boston for our 30th anniversary, the one that still fit as well as it ever had, and the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I wanted to feel like myself, whole, particular, someone with a history that predated and would outlast any single Thursday. Harold drove me. He had suggested it, and I had accepted, because arriving alone would have been fine, but arriving with Harold was better. Harold, who had known Gary since Gary was a boy in Little League, who had delivered Robert's eulogy with the kind of steadiness that earns respect in a room, who was now walking into that meeting room as my attorney and my witness. The symbolism was not lost on me. Some symbols are simply the truth made visible. Gary had booked a conference room at the real estate firm, Alderton and Moore, a mid-size practice downtown with good lobby furniture and a view of the river. When Harold and I arrived at 9:30, Gary and Brenda were already there, along with a young man in a good suit who introduced himself as Derek, an associate at the firm who would be handling the transaction documents. Gary's face when I walked in with Harold was a precise and uncomplicated thing. He had expected me to come alone, possibly nervous, possibly compliant. He had not expected Harold. He had not expected the way I sat down with my folder and looked at him across the table with nothing in my expression except attentiveness. Brenda's hand, I noticed, gripped her purse strap. Derek opened with a prepared preamble about the purpose of the meeting: the proposed sale of a residential property at the Elm Creek Road address, the associated power of attorney documentation authorizing the transaction, and a packet of papers he slid across the table toward me. Harold stopped him before I could touch them. "Before we proceed," Harold said, in the voice he used when he intended to be heard clearly and without repetition, "I need to establish a few points for the record. First, the power of attorney that was represented to this firm as authorization for this transaction was formally revoked on the 21st of October and recorded with the county recorder's office the same day. I have a certified copy of that filing." He placed it on the table. "Second, the property in question was transferred into a revocable living trust on the 28th of October. Mrs. Callahan is the sole trustee and retains full control. A stranger has no authority to sell a trust asset. I have a certified copy of the trust document as well, a second document placed beside the first. Third, Mrs. Callahan is present, fully competent and fully represented by counsel. She has not consented to this transaction. She does not consent to this transaction." The room was very quiet. Derek looked at the documents Harold had placed on the table. He looked at Gary. Then he picked up the county recorder's certification and read it. He was a young man, but he was not a foolish one. I watched his expression move through stages: confusion, understanding, and then something that looked very much like the specific displeasure of a professional who has been placed in an uncomfortable position by someone who was not his client. "Mr. Callahan," Derek said carefully, "when you engaged this firm, you represented that you held a current and valid power of attorney for this transaction." "I do," Gary said, but his voice had lost something. "That revocation, she was confused. She was manipulated by—" "The revocation is dated, notarized, and recorded," Harold said. "Mrs. Callahan is sitting at this table in full possession of her faculties. Would you like her to demonstrate that for you? This is—" Gary stood up. "This is a setup. She's been manipulated. She doesn't understand what she's—" "Gary." My voice was quiet, but it stopped him. He looked at me across the table. His mother, 73 years old, wearing her mother's earrings, with a folder of documents and an attorney, and 41 years of a life he had been trying to liquidate. And I held his gaze without difficulty. "I understand everything," I said. "I understood when you sat at my kitchen table in October and told me you were selling my home. I understood when you called First Heritage Savings and misrepresented your authority to access my accounts. I understood when you came to my house on 3 separate occasions to pressure me into compliance. I have documentation of all of it. Harold has copies. My bank has copies. The county recorder's office has copies." "Dorothy," Brenda began. "I also want you to know," I continued, turning to her, "that my new will has been executed and witnessed. Its terms are final. Harold is the executor. Patricia is my successor trustee. These decisions are not subject to revision based on Sunday afternoon visits with coffee cake." Brenda's face did something I had not expected. It crumpled, just briefly, before she reassembled it. Not grief, I thought. Calculation. She was recalculating. Derek had set the transaction documents quietly face down on the table. He would not be filing them. That was clear from the way he held himself, the posture of a professional distancing himself from a problem he had not created and did not intend to share. Gary put both hands flat on the table. For a moment, I genuinely did not know what he would do. I had seen my son angry before, but not like this. Not with this quality of helplessness in it. The rage of a man who has built an entire structure on a foundation that has just been revealed as non-existent. "You're choosing that man," he said, "over your own family, over me." "I'm choosing myself," I said. I should have been more practiced at it a good deal earlier. Harold gathered his documents. I gathered mine. We stood. Derek extended his hand to Harold and said he would be in touch, meaning, I understood, that Alderton and Moore would be extracting themselves from this situation, promptly and entirely. He did not extend his hand to Gary. We walked out into the bright November morning, Harold and I stood for a moment on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky. That cold, particular blue that only exists in November. And I breathed. "Well," Harold said beside me. "Well," I agreed. What happened after the 14th unfolded over weeks, and I want to tell it plainly. Alderton and Moore sent Gary a formal letter 5 days after the meeting, declining to continue representing him. They had discovered he had misrepresented his authority, and they wanted no part of what followed. Harold sent Gary's attorney a letter outlining the documented misuse of the power of attorney, the First Heritage Savings Inquiry specifically, noting that misrepresenting authority to a financial institution could constitute fraud under state statute. It said, in perfectly measured legal language, "We see what you did, we have the documentation, and what happens next depends on you." Gary did not file for guardianship. A court proceeding would have required him to explain, under oath, the bank inquiry, the misrepresentation to Alderton and Moore, the 3 pressure visits, all of it. Harold's letter made clear we were prepared to present everything. The calculation no longer balanced in his favor. 2 months after the meeting, I received a brief letter from Gary's attorney acknowledging the revoked power of attorney, the trust, and that his client was stepping back from involvement in Mrs. Callahan's estate planning. A lawyer's way of saying, "We're done." I read it at my kitchen table on a January morning, snow falling outside, coffee warm in my hands. What I felt was not triumph. It was quieter, more like the feeling after a long illness breaks, when your body remembers what it feels like to simply be well. The trust would hold. The will would hold. Patricia knew everything. There were no loose ends. What I had won was not simply a house. I had won the right to make my own decisions, a right frequently taken from old women by people who call it care. I had walked into that October morning without knowing I would have to fight. I walked out of the Alderton and Moore conference room knowing exactly who I was. 73 years old, clear-eyed, the owner of my own life. Gary never called. I sent him a Christmas card, brief, dignified, because some habits of civility are worth keeping even when affection is gone. But grieving a person who never quite existed is not grief. It is the final, necessary act of seeing clearly. Spring came to Elm Creek Road as it always did. The crocuses appeared in March, reliably purple, indifferent to everything that had happened in the house behind them. My life after the fight looked the same from the outside. Same house, same garden, same book club and church. The difference was internal, a settledness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The house was not a place I was defending anymore. It was simply home again. I began volunteering twice a week at the county senior services office, sitting with clients to help them understand their legal documents. Not legal advice, just plain language clarity for people who were frightened and had no Harold of their own. I found in it a satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. Patricia visited in April. On the last morning over coffee, she said, "I think you stopped apologizing for taking up space." I sat with that. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe that's exactly it." Gary's commercial real estate practice didn't weather the year well. Clients left, a major deal collapsed, and by fall, he was working from a smaller office. Whether this connected to the money he'd expected from my house, I couldn't say with certainty. But I had done the arithmetic in October, and the timing had never seemed coincidental. Ellen told me carefully that Gary and Brenda's marriage was strained. The guardianship plan had been primarily Brenda's architecture. When it failed, Gary had apparently seen, for the first time, what he had been willing to do. Whether that became true accountability, I didn't know. But something in him had shifted. Emma, their daughter, came for a Saturday in April. We made cookies, our old tradition, and talked about college. When she left, I thought, this one is going to be all right. In August, I sat on the porch with iced tea as the light went gold across the yard, and I thought about the woman who had sat across from Gary in October, already smiling, already knowing, already with Harold's work waiting in a locked drawer. She had known that old does not mean over. She had known that the person most responsible for protecting her was herself. I finished my tea, listened to the crickets, and went inside to make dinner. There's a thing I know now that I wish I had known at 40, at 50, at 60. Being loved and being respected are not the same thing, and people who love you can still fail to respect you. Your choices, your competence, your right to determine the shape of your own life. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because I know there are women and men sitting right now at kitchen tables holding documents they haven't read carefully enough, wondering if the creeping discomfort they feel about their children, their families, their arrangements is justified or merely the fearfulness of old age. Let me tell you what I learned. Your instincts are data. Discomfort is information. And it is never too late to pick up the phone and call a herald. Protect your documents. Know what you've signed. Build your trust, the legal kind and the human kind, before you need it. What would you have done sitting at that table in October? I'd truly love to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here, whatever your age. And if this story reached you, if it made you think, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with Dorothy Callahan. She would have made you pot roast if she could.